The fire had eaten through the third deck by the time I crawled out of the wreckage, and the only thing louder than the alarms was the screaming of children somewhere below me in the dark. My name is Valeth Sorn, and I was a mid-ranking diplomat for the Rithani Concord, which meant absolutely nothing in that moment, because diplomats cannot stop hull breaches, and diplomats cannot restart dead engines, and diplomats cannot feed 1.6 million starving refugees, drifting through unclaimed space with nowhere left to go. We had 12 ships, colony transports, every one of them, unarmed, unarmored, built to carry families across gentle trade lanes, not to run through hostile territory with failing drives and dwindling food supplies. 3 of the 12 had already gone dark. No power, no life support. We had transferred their passengers to the remaining 9 vessels, which meant every corridor was packed with bodies. Every cargo bay had become a sleeping quarter. Every meal was half a meal, then a quarter of a meal, then a handful of processed grain paste that tasted like chalk and despair. The Draelk hegemony had done this to us. They had decided that Rithani space was their space now, that our homeworlds were sitting on mineral deposits they wanted, and that the simplest solution to a territorial dispute was to remove the territory's inhabitants. Not through negotiation, not through trade agreements, through forced evacuation, detention camps, and the quiet disappearance of anyone who resisted. We were herbivores. Small, physically fragile. We had no military to speak of. When the Draelk warships entered our system, we did the only thing we could do. We ran. And now we were dying slowly instead of quickly, which I suppose was a kind of victory if you squinted hard enough. I had sent distress signals to every major power in the galactic community. The Velthani Dominion, the Korath Federation, the Thessic Combine, the Council of Aligned Species, every single one of them, and every single one of them had responded with the same polite, carefully worded refusal. They were sympathetic to our situation. They condemned the Draelk's actions in the strongest possible terms. But they could not intervene because the Draelk controlled the Verath Corridor, which was the primary transit route for 70% of the galaxy's refined isothenium trade, and sanctioning the Draelk would destabilize markets and hurt economies, and unfortunately, the political climate simply did not allow for direct action at this time. In other words, our lives were worth less than their profit margins. I was standing on the observation deck of our lead ship, the Gentle Passage, watching the third transport burn in silence through the viewport, when the sensor officer grabbed my arm so hard I thought he would break it. Something had just dropped out of faster-than-light travel. One ship, small, a frigate-class vessel with an angular, aggressive design that did not match any profile in our database. It took our systems 4 full seconds to identify its origin, and when the result came through, the sensor officer and I stared at each other in confusion. Human. The ship was human. I knew almost nothing about humans at that time. They were a younger species, recently spacefaring, maybe 40 years into their expansion beyond their home system. They had a small footprint, a handful of colonies, a modest fleet. The major galactic powers treated them the way you might treat a child who had wandered into a room full of adults, patronizing tolerance at best, dismissive indifference at worst. They had no political influence, no economic leverage, and no reason whatsoever to be out here in unclaimed space answering a Rithani distress call. The ship identified itself as the Cold Meridian. Its commander requested permission to dock. I granted it because I had no reason not to, and because at that point, I would have granted docking permission to a comet if it had asked politely. Commander Lucia Voss was the first human I had ever seen in person. She was tall by our standards, with dark hair pulled back from a face that looked like it had been carved from stone, and then weathered by decades of hard use. She wore a uniform that was functional rather than decorative, and she carried herself with the kind of quiet authority that does not need to announce itself. She brought 2 officers with her. One was a medic, the other carried scanning equipment. They walked through our ship in silence, past the families sleeping in corridors, past the medical bay where our doctors were treating malnutrition with supplies that were running out, past the emergency shelter where Rithani children sat in rows, too weak to play, too hungry to cry, just sitting with enormous dark eyes and watching everything with the patience of creatures who had already learned that the universe was not kind. Commander Voss stopped in front of those children. She stood there for a long time. Her medic was quietly reporting numbers to her. Caloric intake levels, dehydration markers, growth deficiency indicators. The children watched her the way prey animals watch a predator. Not with fear exactly, but with the careful stillness of beings who have learned that drawing attention to yourself is dangerous. Then Lucia Voss knelt down. She reached into her uniform pocket and pulled out something small and wrapped in foil. A ration bar, standard human military food. She held it out to the nearest child, a girl who could not have been more than 4 years old, and waited. The girl looked at me. I nodded. She took the bar and bit into it, and something shifted in her face, something small and bright that I had not seen in a Rithani child's expression in weeks. It was not quite a smile. It was the memory of what a smile felt like. Lucia Voss stood up and turned to me. Her face was unreadable. Her voice was steady. She said 5 words that I have carried with me every day for the past 19 years. "We will get you somewhere safe." I told her that was impossible, that we had nowhere to go, that our drives were failing, that we did not have enough fuel to reach the nearest neutral port, that every power in the galaxy had refused to help us because of trade politics and economic self-interest. I laid out every reason why her promise was empty, not out of rudeness, but out of exhaustion and the desperate need to not hope for something that could not happen. She listened to all of it. Then she said, "My ship carries enough fuel reserves to supplement your drives. My engineer can stabilize your power systems. The nearest neutral port is the Varenthi station, 6 weeks from here through the Kale Expanse. It is dangerous, but it is passable. We will escort you." I stared at her. Her frigate had a crew of maybe 60 people. She was proposing to escort 12 refugee transports through 6 weeks of hostile space with a single small warship and no backup. "Why?" I asked. "Because you asked for help," she said, "and we heard you." That was it. No political calculation, no trade negotiation, no request for compensation or future favors. A species with no power, no influence, and no strategic reason to care about the Rithani had heard a distress signal and come running, and their commander was now standing in front of me, offering to risk her crew's lives for a convoy of strangers she had met 10 minutes ago. The 6 weeks that followed were the longest and most harrowing of my life. The Kale Expanse was unpatrolled space, which meant it was hunting ground for Draelk scout patrols looking for exactly the kind of target we represented. Commander Voss positioned the Cold Meridian at the front of our convoy formation and ran continuous sensor sweeps, sleeping in shifts with her bridge crew so that someone was always watching. The first Dralgalk patrol found us in week 2. 2 fast attack corvettes dropped out of FTL on our flank and immediately began targeting our lead transport. The Cold Meridian broke formation and engaged both ships simultaneously. I watched from the Gentle Passage's observation deck as the human frigate moved with a speed and aggression that I had never seen from any vessel. It did not fight the way galactic doctrine prescribed. It fought the way a cornered animal fights, with absolute commitment and zero hesitation, closing to ranges that would have been considered suicidal by any tactical manual I had ever read. The Cold Meridian destroyed 1 corvette and drove the other off. It took damage. 2 of its crew were killed. The second encounter came in week 4. 3 Draelk ships this time. The battle lasted 2 hours. The Cold Meridian lost 5 more crew members. Commander Voss took a piece of shrapnel through her left shoulder and refused to leave the bridge until the engagement was over. 7 humans died for us. 7 people who had no obligation to be there, who gained nothing from protecting us, who simply refused to let refugees be hunted down in empty space. When we finally reached Varenthi Station, the Cold Meridian was barely holding together. Its hull was scarred. Its weapons systems were depleted. Its crew was exhausted and grieving. Commander Voss oversaw the docking procedures for all 12 transports, ensured that every Rithani passenger was processed and given shelter, and then prepared to leave. I stopped her at the airlock. I asked her what the Rithani owed her people. She looked at me with those steady, unreadable eyes and said, "Nothing. This is just what you do." But I am Rithani, and we do not forget. Our government formally recorded the debt in our oldest legal tradition, a document we call a life ledger. It is an unbreakable civilizational obligation, a sacred record of what is owed and to whom. The humans, still a minor species with no real standing in galactic affairs, probably never even learned that we had done it. That was 19 years ago. I am telling you this now because everything has changed. Humanity is no longer a minor species. They are no longer a small collection of colonies with a modest fleet and no political influence. What they have become in the past 2 decades is something that the galaxy is only now beginning to understand, and the understanding is arriving with the force of a shockwave. 3 days ago, the Rathani Concord received a message from Earth's unified command. It was addressed to our High Chancellor. It was brief, it was courteous, and it contained a single statement that made every diplomat in our government stop breathing. The message read, "We have not forgotten what the Draelk did to your people. The ledger is open on our side too." I read those words, and I felt something I had not felt in 19 years. I felt the ground shift beneath my feet. Because I remembered Lucia Voss kneeling in front of a starving Rathani child. I remembered 7 humans dying in the dark between stars, for people they had never met. And I understood, with a certainty that went deeper than logic, that whatever was coming next was going to change everything. The galaxy was about to learn what happens when humans repay a debt. I have been a diplomat for 31 years. I have sat in chambers where wars were negotiated into truces, and truces were negotiated into treaties, and treaties were broken before the ink was dry. I have watched empires posture and bluff, and threaten and retreat. I have learned to read the temperature of a room the way a navigator reads stellar currents, by subtle shifts in pressure and tone that most beings never notice. But I had never walked into a room that felt like the one I entered on that morning at the Galactic Concourse. The Concourse is the neutral political hub of the galaxy, a massive orbital station positioned in unclaimed space, designed specifically so that no species can claim jurisdictional authority over its proceedings. It seats representatives from over 300 spacefaring civilizations. It is a place of measured words and careful gestures, where even the most hostile adversaries maintain the polished veneer of diplomatic civility. On that morning, the veneer was cracking. I had been summoned by emergency protocol. Every major species had sent senior representatives. The observation galleries were packed. The communication channels were flooded with encrypted traffic. And the reason for all of it was a single document that had been formally submitted to the Concourse Registry 14 hours earlier. Humanity had issued a declaration of military intervention against the Draelk hegemony on behalf of the Rathani Concord. I need to be clear about something. We did not ask for this. The Rathani government did not invoke the life ledger. We did not request military assistance. We did not even hint at it. Over the past 19 years, the Draelk had consolidated their hold on our former homeworlds, and we had rebuilt our civilization on the 3 colony worlds that remained to us. We were smaller than before, diminished, but we had survived, and survival was enough. Humanity did this on their own initiative. The chamber was arranged in its standard configuration, concentric rings of seating rising from a central speaking floor. The Draelk delegation occupied a prominent section, their ambassador flanked by military advisors in ceremonial armor. The Draelk are impressive-looking creatures, tall, broad, dense musculature covered in overlapping plates of natural bone armor. They look like they were designed for intimidation, and they have spent centuries perfecting the art of using that physical presence to dominate diplomatic encounters. Their ambassador was a veteran named Kreth Voshan, a being I had dealt with before. He was furious. I could see it in the rigid set of his jaw plates, and the way his claws kept flexing against the arm of his chair. The Draelk were not accustomed to being challenged. Their military had conquered 11 species and absorbed 6 sovereign territories over the past century. They controlled trade routes that made them economically untouchable. No one had ever issued a formal declaration of military intervention against them, until today. The human delegation entered the chamber, and the room changed. I had not seen the human ambassador before. Her name was Catherine Wells, and she held the title of Director of External Affairs for Earth's Unified Command. She was not physically imposing. She was average height, lean, with close-cropped silver hair and the kind of face that gave away absolutely nothing. She moved through the chamber with an economy of motion that suggested military training, and she took her position on the speaking floor as if she had been doing this her entire life. Behind her stood 4 human officers in dress uniforms. They stood at parade rest, hands clasped behind their backs, faces blank. I noticed that several delegations were studying them with undisguised fascination. Many species in the chamber had never seen humans in person. They were examining them the way you might examine a species you had previously dismissed as irrelevant and were now desperately trying to reassess. I should explain what had happened to humanity over the past 19 years, because the galaxy had largely failed to pay attention, and that failure was now becoming extremely relevant. When the Cold Meridian had escorted our convoy to safety, humanity had possessed maybe 30 warships and a dozen colonies. They were a minor power by every metric. Their technology was derivative, mostly reverse-engineered from galactic standard systems. Their economy was small. Their diplomatic footprint was negligible. The major powers had categorized them as a prematurity civilization, decades away from being taken seriously. The major powers had made a catastrophic error. Humans, I learned later, do not expand the way other species expand. Most civilizations grow outward in predictable patterns, establishing colonies along trade routes, building infrastructure, gradually increasing their footprint over generations. Humans did something different. They grew inward first. They took the galactic technologies they had acquired, tore them apart down to the fundamental principles, and then rebuilt them from scratch, not to replicate what already existed, but to improve it. Their FTL drives were now faster than anything else in the galaxy. Not marginally faster, significantly faster. They had developed propulsion systems that allowed their ships to make short-range jumps with a precision that galactic engineers said was theoretically impossible. Their weapons systems operated on principles that no intelligence agency had been able to fully analyze. Their shipyards, which they had built in deep space far from any trade lane or diplomatic observation post, were producing warships at a rate that defied reasonable projections. By the time anyone thought to take accurate measurements, humanity's combined military tonnage had surpassed several mid-tier galactic powers combined. They had not announced this. They had not boasted about it. They had simply built it, quietly and methodically, while the rest of the galaxy looked the other way. Ambassador Kreth Voshan spoke first, as the aggrieved party under concourse protocol. His voice filled the chamber like a rock slide, deep and grinding and full of barely controlled rage. This declaration is an act of aggression against a sovereign galactic power, he said. The Draelk hegemony has committed no offense against humanity. We have no territorial disputes with Earth. We have no trade conflicts. This intervention is unprovoked, illegal, and will be met with the full force of the hegemony's military if any human vessel enters our space. He went on for several minutes, citing galactic law, invoking mutual defense pacts, threatening economic sanctions against any species that supported humanity's action. It was a well-crafted speech, intimidating, forceful, the kind of speech that had made other species back down for 100 years. Director Catherine Wells listened to every word without expression. When Voshan finished, she stood, straightened her uniform jacket, and walked to the center of the speaking floor. She did not raise her voice. She did not posture. She spoke the way someone speaks when they have absolute certainty in what they are about to say. 19 years ago, the Draelk hegemony initiated a campaign of forced displacement against the Rathani Concord. 12 unarmed colony ships, carrying 1.6 million civilians, were driven from their homeworlds. No galactic power intervened. The Rathani were abandoned by this chamber, by its members, and by every institution that claims to stand for the rights of sovereign species. She paused. The silence in the chamber was absolute. A single human frigate, the Cold Meridian, answered the Rathani distress call. We escorted those ships to safety. 7 of our crew gave their lives in that effort. We did not ask for recognition. We did not seek compensation. We acted because it was right. She turned slowly, addressing the full chamber. In the years since, the Draelk hegemony has not merely occupied Rathani space. We have evidence, verified through independent intelligence channels and corroborated by multiple sources, of systematic atrocities committed against the Rathani population that remained on the occupied worlds. Director Wells activated a display, and the chamber's holographic projectors filled the air with images and data. Documentation of mass detention facilities on the Rathani homeworld of Asara, records of forced population transfers, medical reports detailing systematic programs designed to suppress Rithani reproduction, cultural archives destroyed, libraries burned, schools converted into processing centers. 15 years of quiet, methodical cruelty, hidden behind the Dreyalk's economic leverage and the galaxy's willingness to look the other way. I sat in my seat and stared at those images, and I felt something break inside me. I had known it was bad. I had heard the reports from survivors who had managed to escape, but seeing it documented with this level of detail, seeing the evidence laid bare in front of 300 species who had chosen to do nothing, was something different entirely. The chamber was quiet, not the quiet of attention, but the quiet of shame. I could see it on their faces. The Velthani delegation was studying the floor. The Korath representatives had gone very still. They had all known. Perhaps not every detail, but they had known enough. And they had calculated the cost of intervention against the cost of cheap isothenium and affordable trade goods. And they had decided that Rathani lives were an acceptable price to pay for stable markets. Director Wells let the silence sit for exactly the right amount of time, long enough to be felt, not so long that it lost its edge. Then she spoke again. 19 years ago, 7 of our people died so that Rathani children could live. We will not allow that sacrifice to have been made in vain. The Dreyalk will answer for what they have done, with or without this council's blessing. Ambassador Voshan surged to his feet. His bone plates were flared, a display of physical threat that would have sent most species retreating. You dare threaten the hegemony. You are a minor species. A footnote. The Dreyalk fleet numbers 900 warships. Any vessel that enters our territory will be crushed, and we will burn your colonies to ash as payment for this insult. I expected Director Wells to respond with matching aggression. That is how galactic diplomacy works. You meet threats with threats, escalation with escalation, until someone blinks. Catherine Wells did not blink. She did not raise her voice. She did not flare or posture or puff up. She smiled. It was a small smile, controlled, patient, and something about it made every instinct in my body scream with alarm. It was the smile of someone who knew something that no one else in the room knew, and who was about to share it at precisely the right moment. Ambassador Voshan, she said, her voice carrying the calm certainty of gravity itself. Your border patrols have already been neutralized. As of 9 hours ago, the 2nd and 4th human expeditionary fleets are inside your territory. The chamber erupted. Voshan was shouting. His military advisors were pulling up tactical displays on personal devices and going pale as the data confirmed what Wells had just said. Delegations from a dozen species were on their feet, some in alarm, some in disbelief, some in the dawning recognition that the galaxy's power dynamics had just shifted beneath them without warning. I sat very still in my seat and watched the chaos, and I understood something that most of the beings in that chamber had not yet grasped. Humanity had not come to the concourse to ask for permission. They had come to deliver a notification. I had never been aboard a human warship before, and I want to be honest about what it felt like. It felt like being swallowed by something enormous and purposeful, like stepping inside the body of a predator and feeling its heartbeat in the walls. The flagship was called the Absolution. It was the command vessel of the 2nd Human Expeditionary Fleet, and it was the largest warship I had ever seen. Not the most elegant, not the most decorative. Human ships did not bother with the aesthetic flourishes that other species considered essential. There were no sweeping lines or ornamental hull features. The Absolution was built the way a fist is built, compact, dense, and designed for one thing. I was there as an official Rithani observer. Humanity had invited us to witness what they called Operation Daybreak. They wanted us to see it. They wanted us to understand that this was being done in our name, and they wanted us to verify, through our own eyes, that it was done with precision and restraint. The Dreyalk hegemony had 912 warships at the start of that day. They were a battle-hardened military force that had conquered 11 species over the course of a century. Every galactic military analyst I had spoken to in the days before the operation predicted a prolonged campaign. Conservative estimates said 6 months. Optimistic estimates said 2 years. Every model accounted for the Dreyalk's defensive advantages, their established supply lines, their numerical superiority, their knowledge of their own territory. The campaign lasted 11 days. I was standing on the bridge of the Absolution when the first engagement began, and I need to describe what I saw because I do not think the galaxy fully understands what happened, even now. The Draelk had assembled a defense fleet of over 300 ships at the Asara approach, the primary route to the occupied Rathani homeworld. It was a formidable formation, layered defenses with overlapping fields of fire, anchored by the Draelk flagship, a massive dreadnought called the Crushing Will. Standard galactic doctrine would have called for a cautious approach, probing attacks to test the defensive lines, gradual attrition of the outer formations, a slow tightening of the noose over weeks or months. The humans did not follow standard galactic doctrine. Fleet Admiral Nathan Cross stood at the tactical display, a lean man with gray eyes and a stillness about him that reminded me of deep water. He gave a single order, and the second fleet moved. They did not advance in formation. They did not approach on a predictable vector. Instead, the entire fleet fragmented into dozens of small strike groups, and each group made a short-range FTL jump, a micro-jump, directly into the heart of the Draelk formation. I need you to understand how insane this was. Short-range FTL jumps inside a combat zone were considered suicidal by every spacefaring species in the galaxy. The margin of error is measured in fractions of a second and meters of space. A miscalculation of even the smallest degree means materializing inside an enemy ship or an asteroid, or the void between dimensions. No species had ever attempted it in combat, because the computational requirements were beyond anything that existing navigation systems could handle. Human navigation systems were not existing systems. They had built something new. The strike groups appeared inside the Draelk formation like ghosts materializing from nothing. They were already firing before the Draelk sensors had finished registering their arrival. The precision was terrifying. Each strike group hit its designated target and then jumped again, vanishing before the Draelk could bring their weapons to bear, reappearing behind another section of the formation, firing, jumping, firing, jumping. The Draelk formation, which had been designed to repel a conventional assault, collapsed in on itself. Ships were firing in every direction, trying to track targets that refused to exist in one place for more than a few seconds. Friendly fire incidents cascaded through the defensive lines. Command and control broke down as the Draelk flagship lost communication with its subordinate formations. In 43 minutes, the Draelk defense fleet at Asara was scattered. Over 100 ships were disabled or destroyed. The Crushing Will, the Draelk flagship, was dead in space, its engines shattered by a strike group that had jumped to within point-blank range, delivered a concentrated burst of fire directly into the engineering section, and jumped away before the dreadnought's point defense could respond. The human fleet had not lost a single ship. I stood on the bridge of the Absolution and watched the tactical display update in real time, and I felt my understanding of the galaxy rearrange itself. This was not a battle. This was a demonstration. Humanity had not come to fight the Draelk. They had come to dismantle them with surgical precision, the way a technician dismantles a machine, one component at a time, with efficiency and without emotion. Admiral Cross ordered the Draelk survivors to be recovered and given medical treatment. The Draelk admiral, a decorated commander named Voresh Kal, was brought aboard the Absolution and treated with formal military courtesy. He was given quarters, he was provided with food appropriate to his species. His wounds were treated by human medics. When he was brought to the bridge to formally surrender, Admiral Cross saluted him. The salute, somehow, seemed to frighten the watching galaxy more than the battle had. Over the next 10 days, the pattern repeated across Draelk space. Human strike groups appeared without warning, engaged Draelk military assets with devastating precision, and withdrew. They did not target civilian infrastructure. They did not bombard population centers. They did not attack supply ships or merchant vessels. They targeted military installations, command nodes, and defensive fleets, nothing else. On day 4, I watched a human strike group bypass a Draelk colony world entirely, leaving its civilian population untouched, to engage a military shipyard 3 systems away. The Draelk had placed weapon emplacements on the colony world, using the civilian population as shields. The humans simply went around them. I asked Admiral Cross about this, and he gave me an answer that I have thought about many times since. He said, "We are not at war with the Dryalk people. We are at war with the Dryalk military command structure that authorized the occupation and abuse of Rithani civilians. When that structure no longer exists, the war is over." On day 7, I was invited to visit the forward operations section of the Absolution, and there I met Lieutenant Commander Dex Harlan. He was a Marine officer, built like a piece of industrial equipment, with hands that looked like they could crush stone, and eyes that were surprisingly warm when he laughed, which he did often. Harlan was overseeing the planning for the ground operations that would liberate the occupied Rithani worlds. I asked him about the campaign, about how humanity had achieved such devastating effectiveness against a force that outnumbered them and had been established in its territory for nearly 2 decades. He looked at me for a long moment, then pulled up a display that showed a planning database. It was vast, thousands of files, tens of thousands of data points, patrol routes, supply schedules, communication frequencies, officer profiles, defensive weakness analyses, infrastructure maps, all of it meticulously organized, cross-referenced, and updated. "We have been building this for 12 years, he said. "Every Dryalk patrol route, every supply line, every command vulnerability. We mapped it all. We ran simulations. We built training scenarios based on real Dryalk tactical doctrine. We practiced this campaign over and over until every officer in the fleet could execute their role in their sleep." 12 years. They had spent 12 years planning a war for a species that never asked them to fight. I asked him why. I asked him the same question I had asked Lucia Voss 19 years earlier, because I still did not understand. Why would a species invest 12 years of planning and resources to liberate a people they had no strategic interest in protecting? Dex Harlan put down the display. He leaned forward in his chair, and his voice dropped to something quiet and serious. "When the Cold Meridian found your convoy, your people were starving. You had almost nothing left, and the first thing your leaders did was take food from your children's rations and give it to our crew. Your kids were hungry, and you fed our people first. Do you understand what that meant to us?" I did not answer. We had been in space for decades by that point. We had encountered dozens of species. Every single one of them treated us like we did not matter. Like we were too small, too new, too insignificant to bother with. Some of them cheated us in trade deals. Some of them ignored our communications entirely. One species arrested our merchants on false charges, just because they could. And then your people, who had nothing, who were dying, gave us their food. He paused. We do not forget that, ever. On day 9, the Dryalk Military Command formally requested a ceasefire. On day 10, terms were negotiated. On day 11, the occupation of Rithani space was officially ended. I went down to the surface of Asara on day 12 with the first humanitarian team. The planet I remembered from intelligence reports and historical archives was unrecognizable. The cities had been stripped of Rithani cultural markers. Street signs were in the Dryalk language. Public spaces had been redesigned to accommodate Dryalk physiology, not ours. It was erasure, the quiet, systematic removal of a people's identity from their own world. But the Rithani were still there. They emerged from underground shelters, from hidden basement rooms, from rural communities that the Dryalk had considered too insignificant to fully monitor. Some of them had been hiding for 15 years. Children who had been born in those shelters came up into sunlight they had never seen. Elders who had gone underground as strong adults emerged bent and gray, blinking at the sky. I watched a Rithani woman walk out of a shelter entrance and stop at the sight of human soldiers standing in the street. She did not know what humans were. She had been underground since before most of the galaxy had heard of Earth. She looked at them with the cautious, terrified alertness of someone who had learned that uniforms meant danger. A human medic, a young woman named Claire Ashworth, knelt down in front of her and held out a water canteen. She said something in the human language that I did not need to translate. The tone was enough. The Rithani woman took the water, drank, and then did something that shattered what remained of my composure. She leaned forward and pressed her forehead against Claire Ashworth's hand, which is the Rithani gesture of deepest gratitude, the one we reserve for those who have saved our lives. The medic did not pull away. She did not look confused. She placed her other hand gently on the woman's head and stayed there until the woman was ready to stand. I turned away because I could not watch anymore. Not because it was painful, but because it was too much. Too much kindness. Too much meaning. Too much evidence that the universe was capable of something better than the cold indifference I had spent my career navigating. But the galaxy was not watching the liberation of Asara with the same emotions I was feeling. I found that out when I returned to the Absolution and checked the diplomatic channels. The galactic community was not celebrating. They were not expressing relief or moral satisfaction, or even grudging admiration. They were afraid. The messages flooding in from every major power carried the same undercurrent of barely concealed panic. If humans did this for a minor species, if they spent 12 years planning a war and then executed it in 11 days for a people who never asked and had nothing to offer in return, if a single act of kindness from 19 years ago was enough to motivate the dismantling of a galactic military power, then what would humans do for a real ally? And what would they do to a species that had wronged them? The encrypted messages started arriving that same evening. 6 different galactic powers, including 2 that had refused to help us during the original crisis, all asking the same question through back channels, through intermediaries, through every quiet diplomatic avenue available. The question was simple. The question was desperate. Have we ever offended humanity? The galactic concourse felt different when I returned. The physical structure was the same. The seating was the same. The lighting and climate controls and translation systems were all operating exactly as they always had. But the atmosphere had changed so fundamentally that I might as well have walked into a different building. The post-war diplomatic session was officially convened to address the terms of the Draelk ceasefire and the status of the liberated Rithani worlds. In practice, it was a 300-species exercise in collective panic management. I took my assigned seat in the Rithani section and watched the delegations file in, and the difference from my previous visit was immediately obvious. Species that had ignored the Rithani for decades were suddenly approaching our delegation with warm greetings, offers of aid, trade proposals, and expressions of deep solidarity with our struggle. The Korath ambassador, whose government had refused our distress call 19 years ago, personally walked across the chamber floor to shake my hand and express his civilization's commitment to Rethani sovereignty. I accepted his handshake. I said the appropriate diplomatic words. And I understood perfectly that his sudden interest in Rithani welfare had nothing to do with guilt and everything to do with the fact that the Rithani were now, by virtue of our relationship with humanity, the most dangerous species in the galaxy to offend. The irony was exquisite. We were still the same physically fragile herbivores we had always been. We had no military. We had no weapons. We had nothing except a 19-year-old bond with a species that had just demonstrated, in 11 days and with 0 casualties, the ability to dismantle a galactic military power, like someone dismantling a puzzle. The session began with the formal terms of the Draelk ceasefire, which were straightforward. The Draelk would withdraw from all occupied Rithani territory. They would pay reparations to the Rithani Concord. Their military leadership would face an independent tribunal for the atrocities committed during the occupation. The terms were harsher than anything the concourse had imposed in living memory, and not a single delegation objected. Not one. After the formal business was concluded, the session devolved into what diplomats call open-floor discourse, which is the polite term for a room full of frightened people trying to figure out the new rules of the game they are all playing. I observed the proceedings with what I can only describe as dark amusement. Every species in that chamber was frantically auditing its own history with humanity. I could see it happening in real time. Delegations were huddled over personal displays, reviewing decades of diplomatic records, trade agreements, and official communications, searching for anything that might be interpreted as a slight, or an offense, or an insult. The Velthani Dominion had blocked human membership in the Galactic Trade Consortium 12 years ago. It was a routine political maneuver at the time, the kind of thing major powers did to minor species without a second thought. The Velthani ambassador announced, during the open floor session, that the Dominion was reversing its position and would be sponsoring humanity for preferred trading status within the consortium. He framed it as a gesture of respect for humanity's growing contribution to galactic stability. Everyone in the chamber knew it was a gesture of pure self-preservation. The Korath Federation had arrested a human merchant crew on fabricated charges 8 years ago. The crew had spent 8 months in a Korath detention facility before being quietly released. The Korath government had never acknowledged the incident. Now, the Korath ambassador stood before the chamber and delivered a formal apology, accompanied by financial reparations so generous that they would have been considered absurd under any other circumstances. The apology was unprompted. No one had asked for it. The Korath had simply done the math and decided that the cost of reparations was preferable to the cost of being on the wrong side of humanity's memory. I watched this cascade of preemptive apologies and retroactive goodwill with the detached fascination of a scientist observing a new phenomenon. The entire galactic order was reorganizing itself in real time, and the organizing principle was not power or trade or ideology. It was fear. Specifically, it was the fear of being remembered. After the morning session, I was granted a private meeting with Director Catherine Wells in the human delegation's quarters. The quarters were sparse by diplomatic standards, functional furniture, no decorative elements, the kind of space that suggested its occupants did not plan to spend time on comfort. Director Wells offered me a cup of something hot and dark that humans call coffee. I accepted it. It was bitter and strange, and I found that I liked it. "You have reshaped the galactic order," I told her. "We liberated 3 occupied worlds," she said. "The galactic order reshaped itself because they are afraid of you. They should have been afraid of being complicit in what was happening on Asara. They were not. They are afraid of us instead. I find that instructive." I asked her a question that had been forming in my mind since the campaign began. I asked her how humanity decided which debts to repay and which to leave unpaid. Was there a system, a formula, a threshold of significance that determined when an act of kindness was enough to warrant the kind of response we had just witnessed? Catherine Wells set down her coffee cup and looked at me for a long moment, and I saw something in her expression that I had not expected. She was deciding whether to trust me with something. I watched the decision happen behind her eyes, the calculation, the assessment, the final quiet resolution. "We keep records," she said. "Not just of the Rithani, of everyone." She pulled up a display, and what she showed me changed my understanding of humanity more than the 11-day war ever could. It was a database, massive, comprehensive. Every interaction humanity had ever had with another species was cataloged in it. Every trade deal, fair and unfair. Every diplomatic communication, polite and dismissive. Every act of kindness, every act of cruelty. Every species that had helped humanity when they were small and struggling. Every species that had exploited them, or ignored them, or treated them with contempt. It was all there, organized, cross-referenced, updated continuously. Maintained with the kind of obsessive thoroughness that spoke to something deep and fundamental in the human character. "We have a saying on Earth," Director Wells told me. "An elephant never forgets. Do you know what an elephant is?" I did not. "A large animal from our homeworld, patient, gentle, usually, loyal to its family group across generations, and it remembers everything, every kindness, every threat, every individual who helped it or hurt it, for its entire life." She paused. "We are the elephants of this galaxy, Valith. We remember everything." I sat with that for a moment, feeling the weight of it settle into my understanding. The galaxy was not dealing with a species that had decided to punish the Draelk on a whim. It was dealing with a species that had been quietly, patiently, meticulously recording every interaction it had ever had with every other civilization, building a comprehensive map of who had been kind and who had been cruel, and waiting for the day when it had the power to act on that information. That day had arrived. Director Wells and I spoke for another hour, and I learned things about humanity that I will carry with me for the rest of my life. I learned that the 7 crew members of the Cold Meridian, who died protecting our convoy, are memorialized in a monument on Earth. I learned that their names are taught in human schools. I learned that the Rithani girl who took the ration bar from Commander Voss's hand, whose name was Elith, had been located and identified, and that the Voss family on Earth had been sending educational supplies to Rithani refugee communities in her honor for 16 years, without ever telling anyone. Humans do not forget kindness. They cultivate it. They pass it down. They turn a single moment of compassion into a generational commitment. And then, In the middle of our conversation, the crisis erupted. Director Wells received an urgent communication on her personal device. I watched her expression change as she read it, the careful neutrality sliding away for just a fraction of a second to reveal something hard and cold underneath, something that made me deeply grateful that I was not the subject of whatever she had just learned. She excused herself and left the room. 20 minutes later, I was back in the main chamber for an emergency session. The Thessic Combine, a slaver empire operating on the Galactic Rim, had been holding 42 human colonists. They had been captured in a raid on a human settlement 3 years earlier. The Thessic had been using them as forced laborers in their mining operations. The information had just been confirmed through intelligence channels. The Thessic ambassador was present in the chamber. He was a tall, spindly creature with too many joints and a voice that sounded like metal scraping against glass. When confronted with the evidence, he responded with the casual dismissiveness that the Thessic had always shown toward species they considered inferior. He called it a trade dispute. He suggested that the colonists had entered the Thessic territory illegally and were being detained in accordance with Thessic law. He implied that humanity was overreacting. He used the word inventory to describe 42 living beings. I have been in diplomatic chambers during some very tense moments. I have seen threats delivered and ultimatums issued and alliances shattered in real time, but I have never felt a room change the way that room changed when the Thessic ambassador used the word inventory. Every delegation in the chamber turned to look at Director Catherine Wells. She was standing at the edge of the speaking floor. Her face was absolutely still. Her posture was relaxed, her hands at her sides, her breathing steady. She looked like the calmest person in the room, and that was what made it terrifying, because every single being in that chamber understood that what they were witnessing was not calm, it was control. The kind of control that a person maintains when the alternative is something they have decided the room is not ready to see. The Thessic ambassador seemed to realize, in a delayed and dawning way, that the room was not reacting the way he had expected. He looked around at the faces of 300 delegations and saw something that he had never seen directed at the Thessic Combine before. He saw pity, not for the colonists, for him. Director Wells stood. She straightened her jacket. She spoke with absolute calm. 42. That number will mean something to the Thessic Combine very soon. She walked out of the chamber. Her delegation followed. The doors closed behind them. Within the hour, I received word through military channels that the entire human Fifth Fleet had changed course. Its new heading was the Thessic Combine's sovereign territory, 200 warships, moving at speeds that the Thessic sensor networks would not be able to track. I sat in my quarters that evening and thought about elephants, about patience and memory and the quiet accumulation of debts, both kind and cruel, and I wondered, not for the first time, whether the galaxy understood what it was dealing with. Not a species that was aggressive or violent or expansionist. Something far more dangerous than any of those things. A species that remembered. 6 months. That is how long it took for the galaxy to fully absorb the implications of what humanity had become. The Thessic Combine, as a political entity, no longer exists. I should say that plainly because the facts deserve plainness, and because the manner of its dissolution was so swift and so thorough that embellishment would only diminish the reality. The human Fifth Fleet arrived in Thessic space 4 days after Director Wells walked out of the concourse chamber. The Thessic military, which had spent centuries raiding and enslaving weaker species along the Galactic Rim, had a fleet of approximately 400 warships and a deep space fortress network that was considered one of the most formidable defensive systems in the galaxy. The campaign lasted 4 days. I was not present for the Thessic operation. I did not need to be. The intelligence reports told the story clearly enough. The humans used the same micro-jump tactics they had employed against the Drelelk, but faster and with even greater precision. The Thessic fortress network, which had been designed to withstand prolonged siege by conventional fleets, was bypassed entirely. Human strike groups jumped past the fortresses, hit the Thessic command infrastructure, and dismantled the military hierarchy from the top down. Without central coordination, the fortress garrisons surrendered within hours. The 42 human colonists were recovered alive, all of them, The human commanders had made their recovery the operational priority above all else, designing the entire campaign around the fastest possible extraction. The colonists were malnourished and traumatized, but they were breathing. They were free. The Thessic Combine's governing council was arrested and turned over to the Galactic Concourse for prosecution. The Thessic military was dissolved. The slave populations held throughout Thessic territory, over 2 million beings from 16 different species, were liberated. No one in the galactic community objected. No one even pretended to object. The Thessic had been slavers for centuries, and every species in the galaxy had known it, and every species had tolerated it, because the Thessic were useful trading partners for rare minerals extracted from their mining operations. The same pattern as the Draelk, the same complicity, the same calculated indifference. Humanity had not tolerated it. Humanity had catalogued it, planned for it, and dismantled it with the same patient, methodical precision they had applied to the Draelk hegemony. 2 military campaigns, 2 entrenched galactic powers reduced to rubble, 0 human ships lost. The message was received. I spent the months that followed watching the galactic order reorganize itself around a principle that no species had ever had to account for before. The principle was simple and devastating, and I will state it as clearly as I can. Humans remember. They remember kindness, and they repay it with a loyalty so fierce and so enduring that it transforms the recipient. The Rithani Concord is now one of the most protected civilizations in the galaxy. Not because we have a military, not because we have economic leverage, not because we are politically influential. We are protected because every species in the galaxy knows, with bone-deep certainty, that harming the Rithani means answering to humanity. And answering to humanity means facing a species that has spent years, possibly decades, studying your weaknesses, mapping your vulnerabilities, and preparing a response that will be so precise, so overwhelming, and so efficient, that your military will cease to exist before your government has finished drafting its first defensive order. They remember cruelty with equal precision. The galaxy has begun to internalize this, and the behavioral changes are extraordinary. Species that once exploited weaker civilizations as a matter of routine are suddenly discovering the virtues of fair trade and mutual respect. Galactic powers that treated minor species with contempt are now going out of their way to demonstrate goodwill, not because they have had a moral awakening, but because they have realized that the cost of cruelty, previously zero, is now potentially catastrophic. I attended the formal ceremony where the Rithani life ledger was officially closed. The ceremony was held on the surface of Essara, our recovered homeworld, in the central plaza of the capital city that the Draelk had renamed and reshaped, and that we were now, slowly, making ours again. The human delegation was led by someone I had not seen in 19 years, Admiral Lucia Voss. She was gray-haired now, and she carried herself with the careful deliberation of someone who had earned every scar and every line on her face. She wore her dress uniform, and on her chest, she carried the medals of a career spent in service. But the one I noticed was small and silver and bore the insignia of the Cold Meridian. She still wore it. After everything, she still wore the badge of the frigate that had found us in the dark. The ceremony was brief, as Rithani ceremonies tend to be. Our High Chancellor read the life ledger entry that had been recorded 19 years ago. The debt was named. The acts of sacrifice were enumerated. The 7 crew members who had died were honored by name. And then the ledger was formally closed. The debt declared fulfilled. The obligation discharged. I was the one chosen to deliver the closing words to Admiral Voss. I walked across the plaza, past the ranks of Rithani citizens who had gathered to witness the ceremony, past the human honor guard standing at attention, and I stood in front of the woman who had knelt before a starving Rithani child and offered her food from her own pocket. "The debt is repaid," I said. "The Rithani Concord considers its obligation to humanity fulfilled. We thank you for what you have done. We thank you for the blood your people shed on our behalf. We thank you for the liberation of our worlds. We thank you for the justice you brought when no one else would." Admiral Voss looked at me, and her expression was the same unreadable steadiness I remembered from 19 years ago. She shook her head. "You do not owe us anything," she said. "You never did." I pressed the point. humanity had dismantled an empire for us. They had liberated 3 occupied worlds. They had spent 12 years planning a war, and then executed it in 11 days. They had reshaped galactic politics and redrawn the boundaries of power. They had done all of this without being asked, without expectation of reward, without any strategic interest beyond the simple fact that the Rithani had once been kind to them. How could that not be a repayment? Lucia Voss was quiet for a moment. Around us, the plaza was still. The wind moved through the recovering gardens of Asara, carrying the scent of plants that had been replanted in soil that had been Rithani for 10,000 years before the dry elk came, and that was Rithani once again. "When the cold meridian found your convoy," she said, "my crew was tired. We had been on patrol for weeks. Our supplies were low. We were far from home, and we were, frankly, insignificant. Every species we had encountered in our expansion treated us like we did not matter. Some were polite about it. Most were not. We were tolerated at best, exploited at worst. We had begun to wonder if that was simply how the galaxy worked, if being new meant being expendable." She paused, and I saw something shift in her face. Something that moved beneath the surface of her composure, like a current beneath still water. "And then your people, who had nothing, who were starving, who were dying, took food from your children and gave it to my crew. You shared your children's rations with strangers who had no claim on your compassion and no power to repay it. Do you know what that meant to us?" I waited. It meant that we were not alone. It meant that somewhere in this galaxy, there was a species that understood what it meant to be decent. Not because it was strategic, not because it was profitable, because it was right. Her voice was steady, but there was a weight behind it that I could feel in my chest. "That was not a debt, Valith. That was a bond. And bonds are not repaid. They are honored." I stood in front of her and felt the truth of what she was saying settle into me, and I understood, finally, what 19 years of confusion and gratitude had been building toward. The galaxy believed that humanity kept a ledger, that they tracked debts and repaid them with mechanical precision, kindness for kindness, cruelty for cruelty, a vast accounting system of interspecies obligations. The galaxy was wrong. Humanity did not keep a ledger, they kept a memory. And there is a difference, a vast and profound difference, between accounting and remembrance. A ledger is transactional. It balances. It can be closed. Memory is something else entirely. Memory is the thing that makes a woman carry the badge of a small frigate for 19 years. Memory is the thing that makes a family send educational supplies to refugee children they have never met. Memory is the thing that makes a species spend a decade preparing to fight a war for people who shared their food when they had none. The ceremony ended, the delegations dispersed. Admiral Voss and I walked together through the streets of the recovering capital, and she told me about the 7 crew members who had died protecting our convoy. She told me their names. She told me about their families, their hobbies, their favorite foods, the small, ordinary details that make a life real and specific and irreplaceable. She had carried those details for 19 years. She would carry them for the rest of her life. That evening, I returned to my quarters and received a briefing on the state of galactic affairs. The report was comprehensive and, in its way, remarkable. Every major power in the galaxy had launched what amounted to a goodwill campaign toward humanity. Trade concessions, diplomatic overtures, military cooperation agreements, cultural exchange programs. Species that had spent decades ignoring humanity were now falling over themselves to demonstrate friendship and respect. The Velthani had funded a human cultural center on their capital world. The Korath had established a joint military training program. Even the remaining Draelk civilian government, which was rebuilding under the terms of the ceasefire, had sent a formal message of reconciliation to Earth. The galaxy thought it was managing a threat. It believed that by being kind to humanity now, by filling the positive side of humanity's imagined ledger, it could insulate itself from the kind of response that the Draelk and the Thesak had received. It was, in essence, trying to buy insurance. But I knew something that the rest of the galaxy did not. I had seen the way humans looked at the Rithani. Not with calculation, not with strategic assessment, not with the measuring gaze of a species evaluating a potential asset. They looked at us with warmth, genuine warmth. The The kind of warmth that cannot be manufactured or performed or maintained as a diplomatic strategy. The kind of warmth that one being feels for another when a bond has been formed through shared suffering and mutual compassion, and the quiet, stubborn refusal to let cruelty win. The galaxy thought humanity was keeping score. The truth was simpler than that, and somehow, in a way that I have never been able to fully articulate, far more terrifying. Humans loved the people who were kind to them when no one else was. They loved fiercely and without reservation, and across spans of time that would make other species forget. And there was nothing in the universe, nothing in the vast cold emptiness between stars, more dangerous than a species that loved like that and never, ever forgot. I completed my report to the Rathani High Chancellor that night. I included my analysis, my observations, my recommendations for Rathani policy going forward. And at the end, in the personal notes section that only the Chancellor would read, I wrote a single observation that I believe captures the truth of what the galaxy is now facing. The galaxy trembles because it misreads them. It thinks humanity is vengeful. It is wrong. Humanity is loyal. And that, I have learned, is far more terrifying.